All right, what's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com, and I wanted to take some time to go over Jay Powell's Jackson Hole speech in a way, and really kind of talk about how they're going to attack inflation in a way, and some of the things that they learned about it. In the end of his speech, he actually gives like 3 different lessons that they learned, um, or at least they say they learned during the 1970s and 80s with the Great Inflation and all of that, right? So with that being said, we will head over to screen share and really go into it. And so the FOMC's overarching focus right now is to bring inflation back to their 2% goal. And so that's one of the conversations I've been seeing a lot with like what are they going to do really? They're kind of painted in a corner. Are they going to let like the stock market crash, or they basically have assets take a hit, which would be a major negative for the broad economy in general because of how financialized the United States is now, versus are they going to take back and basically bring down inflation or attempt to, right? And basically, it seems like his entire speech is they've decided completely about what they're going to do and go from there, right? And so he says price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. It is part of their dual mandate. And then it serves as the bedrock of the economy, right? And especially because the burdens of high inflation fall heaviest on those who are least able to bear them, right? That's because the the goods and services that we're experiencing the most inflation with now, and just inflation in general, are things that they're necessities, right, for people. And so that's a much larger percentage of um, expenses in terms of, I guess I should say, income. So the people who are less fortunate do not have as high of an income. Those necessities are a larger portion of their income than more affluent people will say, right? And so you have to keep that in mind. Um, Therefore, basically, reducing inflation is a must, right? Especially for those kinds of people, because they're the ones who are least able to bear those increases in costs. So, reducing inflation is likely to require a sustained period of below trend growth. And this is something we've talked about a few times in a few different videos on here. And so, while higher interest rates, slower growth, and a softer labor market conditions will bring down inflation, they will also bring some pain to households and businesses. You have to pay the piper, right? And so these are the unfortunate costs of reducing inflation. But a failure to restore price stability would mean far greater pain. And so you always have to think about the consequences of your actions, right? And those by consequences, it's not always negative, right? You just have to realize that sometime, excuse me, there's always going to be some form of cost, right? And you really have to think about that before you make decisions. It's just something you always have to keep in mind, right? And so at the most recent meeting, the FOMC meeting in July, they raised the target range for Fed funds to 2.25 to 2.5%, which in the summary of economic projections range of estimates of where the Fed funds rate is projected to settle in the longer run, right? So that's where it's projected to be, right? And then in his next sentence, he says, in current circumstances, with inflation running far above 2% and the labor market extremely tight, estimates of longer run neutral are not a place to stop or pause. And so it seems like, yes, they're expecting Fed funds to settle here in the long run, but they don't. But it seems like they're not going to stop here for the moment. They need to bring inflation and all of the economic kind of situation in general has to improve before they can stop hiking, it seems, right? And so basically they're just passing through this range now, and they see themselves eventually coming back, right? It was just kind of portrayed in the summary of economic projections, right? And so basically there seems like they're going to continue hiking until things improve, so to speak. Or we go through a recession and that sort of thing, and then they're going to bring it back down to this level, and they see this level as being kind of the rate at which they'll stay longer term, right? So restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive policy stance for some time. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy, which we've seen a few times in the past, where basically things would start to get difficult and they'd start QE and loosening monetary policy pretty much right away, before kind of the situation in general proved or that are improved, I should say, and that sort of thing, right? And so basically, it seems like even if we start to go into a deep recession and things start to go very poorly, if inflation, price stability, and all of that don't reach targets, they're not going to loosen regardless, it seems. Or at least that's what they're saying right now, right? And so it's easier to say before it happens, or at least as it's happening. And we know kind of from history that the Fed has a track record of being behind of what they need to do, right? So, kind of getting into his three lessons from the high and volatile inflation of the 1970s and 80s. So, the first lesson is that central banks can and should take responsibility for delivering low and stable inflation, especially when it comes to things like rates and that sort of thing. Now, in terms of like supply shocks and kind of localized things, somewhat like that, um, there's not much they can do in terms of there's absolutely nothing they can do in terms of supply and maybe bringing new supply online. And we're seeing that with a lot of commodities and kind of energy related goods right now, right? Um, but, and as he says later, basically the only thing they can control is demand. And so they need to basically bring down demand until it's kind of more in tune with supply with that respect, right? And so it is also true in his view that the current high inflation in the United States is the product of strong demand and constrained supply, and that the Fed's tools work principally on aggregate demand, pretty much what I was just saying. None of this diminishes the Federal Reserve's responsibility to carry out our assigned task of achieving price stability. There is clearly a job to do in moderating demand to better align with supply, and they're committed to doing that job. Again, not looking back, they're doing what they need to do, so to speak, right? From their own words. And so the second lesson is that the public's expectations about future inflation can play an important role in setting the path of inflation over time. And this is where we get into talking about having inflation expectations well anchored, right? And so basically, that it's that controlling that psychological component of inflation, right? Is basically people are going to act in such a way that kind of mimics where they believe inflation is going to be. And he talks about later basically this concept of rational inattention, right? And so when inflation is high for long periods of times, people and businesses and households in general, they got to pay close attention to it, right? And they kind of incorporate that in their financial decisions, right? Whereas when it's not a problem, meaning low inflation is low or stable or in a place to where people do not notice it day to day, then they basically don't pay that much attention to it, and that's not their main concern, right? Because they're not getting squeezed from that respect financially, right? And so, yeah, and so this is basically one thing we've noticed. If you look back into the 1970s, especially, is that and according to this as well, the same is true for expectations of high and volatile inflation for the 70s. And so as inflation climbed, the anticipation of high inflation became entrenched in the economic decision making of households and businesses, going on kind of what I was just saying, right? And so, kind of concluding and wrapping up the general concepts of the speech, because he even stated in the beginning that he wanted this to be rather short. And so, the third lesson is that they have to continue until the job is done. They can't start easing prematurely, right? And that basically history shows that the employment costs of bringing down inflation are likely to increase with delay as high inflation becomes more entrenched in wage and price setting, right? And so as businesses and households kind of set prices in a way, not that households really set prices, And I guess they kind of do. You could argue with how much they're willing to buy certain things that are more kind of discretionary, but that's a little off topic. But anyway, basically just doing that, right? And so the longer high inflation, the more persistent we have high, if I could word anything, the more persistent high inflation is, basically, the more entrenched it becomes in the decision making of the people. Again, inflation expectations, kind of the same concept, just saying it as a different lesson and kind of looking at it in a different way, it seems. And so basically, like, the longer they wait to attack this problem, the harder it's going to be. And the larger the problems are, the larger the consequences are going to be as well, right? And so that's something you have to keep in mind. And so I guess the major takeaway from Powell's Jackson Hole speech in general is it seems like the Hawks are here to stay. And it's also like I'm pretty sure his term is running out. And so it's really, we're looking at a decent argument for his legacy, right? So how is he going to be remembered in general, right? And so what legacy is he willing to leave behind? Does he want to be looked as kind of like a Volcker 2.0? And it's arguable of whether or not that's possible, right? Or is he basically going to be remembered as kind of just another central banker, right? Is he going to be kind of like a Arthur Burns from the 70s, so to speak? Like, how is that going to play out? And it seems like he has a choice of whether or not he's trying to set his legacy, right? And with that being said, I think it'll be interesting to see how much he actually has a say in that and how much his actions can actually change that. And I think that there's a decent argument that the Fed in general is not some all-powerful institution, and there's not a lot they can do about it, and it's arguable to which degree their actions do so. But again, that gets very nuanced and kind of outside the topic of this video. So we're going to leave this one here, and I'll get some charts together and kind of start and expand a bit more on that concept and like link it to this video or something along those lines so you guys have that as well. So anyways, with that said, I'm going to leave that one here. So I hope you guys have a good night.